Today's daf is daf Tzadi Gimel, and we're going to start with Gufa, which you'll see 4 lines down from the top. But let's just make a point that we're talking about how to identify exactly what chelev is. And chelev, which literally translates as fat, subdivides into two categories. Doraisa, which means that you get malchus if there was hasra, so forth, and kares, and derabana. There's chelev derabana, which is only rabbinic. Now, what we have to know is that in Vayikra Perek Gimel, the pasuk says regarding chelev, it says al haksolim. And those are the two key words here for the beginning of today's daf, al haksolim. So again, I can't tell you exactly where the ksolim are. The English translation here that I have doesn't really do much justice for me because they translate it as flanks. I don't know if, I think, again, I don't want to make myself idiotic, so I don't want to say anything about flanks. I think it has something to do with like muscles. Now, the key point here as we begin today's daf is that it says al haksolim, which means that the chelev that we want to identify is located on top of the flanks. And if you'll see on the top of the Amud, which we did yesterday, chelev shabasar chofel, so it means that apparently there's chelev that's exposed because it's on top of the flanks. So when the butcher cuts up the meat, he'll see imminently he will have vision of the chelev. And then there's chelev that's somehow lower down, covered by the flanks. That's not chelev halaksolim. And the Gemara says, "V'lo bitochak solim," but you're allowed to eat the chelev that's inside the flanks, meaning that's covered. Gufa, Amar Rabbi Abba, Amar Rabbi Yehuda, Mishmuel, chelev shabasar chofel. So, if it's inside the flanks, which means that the meat, or call it the flesh of the animal, covers the chelev, as opposed to the chelev that's on the top, al haksolim, that is exposed. But now we're talking about that which is covered, mutter. That's not chelev. Now, what we're about to learn now is that there's a difference between the live animal and the dead animal. And therefore, when we shech the animal, we have to worry when we try to identify the chelev that is mutter, we have to worry about the fact that although now, as a dead animal, it is covered, but yet while it was alive, it was not covered. So I don't know if anything I said now makes any sense to you, but we'll read another few lines of the Gemara and then hopefully it'll make sense. Any, we have a stira because the same tradition of Rabbi Abba and the name of Rabbi Yehuda, the name of Shmuel, is that Hai Tarba. Now, Tarba, excuse me, is the Aramaic word for chelev. The Tuse, which is underneath, means it's covered. Masne, again, he translates, I don't know. Again, he even has a picture, but the picture doesn't help me, I'm sorry to say. He translates the word masne as loins, Loins. So now we're talking about the chelev that's underneath the loins, which means it's covered, and yet the same exact tradition from Rabbi Abba all the way to Shmuel says it's also. So that even though it's covered, it still is defined and categorized as chelev. How do we reconcile this? Amar Abaye, and now we're going to differentiate between the live animal and the dead animal. Behema b'chayeha peruke mifarka. The animal, as it's alive, walks from place to place, and as it walks, the limbs and the organs of the body are separated one from the other, and the fat that's covered by the loins, which technically should not be considered chelev, is now exposed. And since it's uncovered, even though now the animal is dead and you already shechted it, but it doesn't matter. So when the butcher looks at this chelev, which is mituse masni, he won't see the chelev until he removes, the top layer of basar. But since he knows that chelev was uncovered during the lifetime of the animal, when it was vital and moving around from place to place with the limbs and the organs moving and shifting, therefore it's usher. So could you imagine what kind of a butcher would be relied upon to have gotten rid and removed all the chelev? Because the butcher's going to say, well, look, this chelev is covered and it's underneath the loins. It's not usher, and he would leave it there in the animal. Little does he know, hopefully he does know, but he might not know, that he has to consider that chelev was exposed during the lifetime. Once it was exposed during the lifetime of the animal, it has the status of chelev, and it's usher. So to rely on the butcher, he's got to be very astute. He's got to be a shtickle scholar, and he has to know the anatomy of the animal to determine that this chelev was always, always covered in order to be matir and leave it inside the animal to be shipped off to the marketplace. And he has to realize that even if he identifies chelev by removing the basar, but that chelev might have been exposed during its lifetime. The Gemara now substantiates Abaye with a statement of Rabbi Yochanan, "Ano lav tabcha ani v'lav tavtacha." I think he's paraphrasing the famous phrase, "I'm not a novi, I'm not the son of a novi, so I'm not a butcher." But nevertheless, nehira dahachi havi amri midrash. I remember from my youth that there was a saying in the study hall, "Behema b'chayeh peruke makak," that during its lifetime it moves around, and the loins of the animal will be separated. Amar Rabbi Abba, Amar Rabbi Yehuda, Amar Shmuel. Again, another identical tradition. Chelev shal hahemseis ubeis hakosos asurim v'aser b'karis. So if you start with the esophagus and the food goes through the esophagus, which is called the veshet, down to stomachs, there are 4 stomachs. And on one of these pages, he has, here it is. He has a diagram of the 4 stomachs. The first stomach, which is right below the esophagus, is called the beis hakosos. And then a little bit moving towards the left, but below it is the hemses. And again, each one of these has a very fancy, Latin word. And then if you move weiter to the left, you get the keres. And then on the bottom, the abu masim, which is the keva. So those are the 4 stomachs of any animal. And the chelev that's on top of these 2, that's the beis hakosos and the hemses, which are the first 2 of the 4 stomachs, they are included under chelev doraisa with a chiv kares. And that's what the Gemara says, that zeu chelev shal hakerev. Again, al hakerev is what we call in the pasuk al haksol. So it seems that out of the 4 stomachs, the chelev is to be taken out of 2 out of the 4 stomachs. He's got a whole description here of what goes on in the 4 stomachs and how each one participates in the digestion process. That I think we can leave that for another time. Again, Omer Rabbi Abba, Omer Rabbi Yehuda, Omer Shmuel, Hi Tarba. Again, we said that the word Tarba is Chelev. The Klibusta, okay, now we have to know what Klibusta is. Asur Yonash Karis. V'zeu Chelev Sha'alak Solim, as we said, the Pasuk says Chelev Alak Solim. So what is Klibusta? So Rashi gives it to you in old French, but in any event, it's somewhere down at the bottom of the spinal column of the animal, and it's a small bone. Now, it is so down that it is attached to the tail of the animal. So again, there's a fancy Latin word for this bone. It's called a sacrum, and it has a fusion of several vertebrae. And it seems that what the Gemara is telling us is that if you get chelev from this klibusta, you should know that that's the real McCoy. That's behind the loins. The bone is behind the loins, but the fat is still shuman. Another tradition, Amar Rabbi Yehuda, is chutin shebiyad asur. Again, there's a lot of anatomy which I can't explain here. The word chutim is going to come up over and over again, literally translated as threads. I think it's referring to the blood vessels. That's what I see here in one of the notes. And now we're talking about the yad, as we mentioned in the past, when we spoke about the extended foreleg of the fetus outside its mother's womb. Anyway, we spoke about yad. Yad is the foreleg. Now, what's really confusing here, if I were to ask you, what's the subject of our daf? I think you'd be sharp enough to say chelev. But then I would tell you, technical foul, we're no longer talking about chelev. Now we're talking about a whole different subject matter. And the Gemara doesn't point this out. Very confusing. What we're talking about now is dam. And you have certain blood vessels that are so saturated with dam that the normal process of getting rid of the dam, which is called malicha, which is a major topic of today's daf, is not sufficient. And we're going to have this over and over again in different parts of the anatomy of the animal where the blood is very, very heavy. So we start here with the foreleg. He says these are the blood vessels from the shoulder. I'm not sure what he means. Maybe from the shoulder it goes to the foreleg. I'm not sure. He says the blood vessels of the shoulder and of the foreleg are prohibited so again, it's very confusing. I don't know exactly what he means by prohibited because you got to read this over and over and over again. He might mean it's prohibited in the normal process of malicha. But because Amar of Safra, Moshe is like a kinui for a Talmud Chacham. Me Amar Achmana lo techel bisra? What the heck are you talking about? These chutim are basar. The Torah allows you to eat the basar after you do the shechita. Amar Rava says, you know what Shmuel had in mind? Chatche umalche afilu k'dera nami shaper dame. We're going to add some element or pu'ula, some action in the requirement of malicha. Normally, malicha means you salt it, and that brings the dam out. once you salt it, again, this is an entire section in your Deich Chelik Aleph of Malicha, then you can cook the meat and eat the meat. But here, in the case of these shoulder blood vessels and foreleg blood vessels, because of the massive volume of dam, it's not enough just to salt it, but rather you need chatre. You got to actually cut the blood vessels and then salt it. By cutting the blood vessels, then the blood spurts out, and then you get rid of all the vestige of the blood through malicha. He says that these threads, which again, I'm not sure if they're veins, are so saturated with blood that mere salting of the meat of the foreleg in the standard malicha will not suffice to extract the blood. Either remove these blood vessels, these veins, get rid of them, or cut them and then salt them. He says the general consensus is that cutting the vein is necessary only for salting. Now, keep in mind, there are alternative methods of getting the blood out without salting, and that's called roasting. In Hebrew, it's called tzli. This is what my mother, Aleh Shalom, used to do for liver. The whole house would stink. Anyway, so she would roast the liver. I remember there was a special utensil that she used to roast the liver. And then you don't have to cut the veins. Okay, later on we're going to discuss what word in English would mean when you put meat on coals. Not barbecuing. Is that barbecuing, grilling? I don't know what you call it. Anyway, we'll see if that has the same status as roasting in a pot. Anyway, let's move on because
sometimes we used to say broiling.
Broiling, okay. Amar Rabbi Yehuda Amar Shmuel, Reish Me'ayim is the kishkis, the intestines. Bi'amsa boy grira. In other words, now we're going back again to chelev. We're going to keep shifting back and forth from chelev to dam, dam to chelev. So with regard to chelev, in the case of the intestines, then we have to scrape off the fat. And what length do these intestines require removing, scraping off the thing? 1 amma. Zeh chelev shal dakim. Dakim are the intestines. V'yamar Rabbi Yehuda chutin sheba oketz asurim. Okay, now we're talking about the nerves that branch down into below the spinal column in the hip. And they extend again to the flanks, and they're asur. And there are 5 of them. Chamisha chutim ispe bekafla. Okay, kafla is the Aramaic word for the flanks. And there are 5 threads in the flanks. Tlasa miyamina v'tatis, 3 on the right and 2 on the left. Tlasa mefatzle litrei trei. It gets even more complicated because the 3 on the right side branch off 2 each. So you're all told 6. Trei mefatzle litlasa. And the 2 on the left branch out to 3. So once again, we have 6. And nafkamina, why do we have to know about all these branches below the spinal column of these threads? De'ish sholef lehu ad dechamimi mishtalfi. You got to chaptetzi, as we say. You know, there's an urgency here in the process because when you shecht an animal, then the meat is warm. It's still warm. And you've got to get rid of these threads, which are prohibited while it's warm. Now, we have to know that these nerves are not exposed. They're not al haksolim that we spoke about in the introduction to today's daf. And therefore, on a derisa level, they're not prohibited because it's only al haksolim. But midrabanan, they asked it. They gave it the status of chaylev midrabanan. You don't get malchus if you eat it. Omar Abayi tem Rav Yehuda chamisha chutim havi. Okay, and now we get to the overlap between the two sugyas that we're learning today, the chaylev sugya and the dam sugya, because Abayi says that amongst these chutim, there are 5 groups that are prohibited, but they subdivided to 2 isurim. Tlasa mishum tarba, 3 are chelev, and train, but 2 are mishum dama. They have an exceptional amount of dam because they're saturated with blood in the blood vessels, in the walls of the blood vessels, and therefore you need to cut it before you do the salting. The tachle ude chafle ude kalyose mishum tarba, the threads of the spleen. Right, so the tchol is the spleen, and kulyosa are the kidneys. These are chelev. One second, I'm missing one. There's supposed to be 3: the spleen, the kidneys. How did I mess up on that? Where's number 3? The spleen. Oh, yeah. And you have the kulyasa, which is the kidneys. They have the tachle, which is the spleen. And kafle, we said, were the flanks. So those 3 are chelev. That's a chelev issue. However, the other 2, the yada, which is the foreleg, the lower, which is the jaw, those are blood vessels that are saturated with dam mishum dama. My nafkamina, hani to mishum dama, imachatechlu malachlu shapidam. If you first cut it and then salt it, you're fine. Hanach, less late takanta. But as far as chelev is concerned, there's nothing you can do to chelev. It's also, you can split it this way, cut it that way, salt it this way. It doesn't matter. It's also. There are 5 membranes in the body of the animal that are full of dam. No, I'm sorry. Again, we're going to split it into 2, the overlap. That are either full of chelev or full of dam. Tlasa mishum tarba, 3 have a chelev problem, and trei mishum dam, saturated blood. The tafli, the kafli, the kulyasa mishum tarba. The spleen, the flanks, and the kidneys is a chelev problem. The bay udemokra. Now we get to the other membranes in the animal's body. One is in the brain, that's called the mokra, and the other is in the testicles. Apparently, the testicles, the scrotum has a membrane that surrounds and encompasses the testicles, and it's full of dam, which means that you got to slice it and then salt it. And that's true also for the membrane in the brain. Rav Yehuda bar Oshiavi called Koliv le Tachlo Levi braid Rav Huna bar Chio. He was peeling off the membrane of a spleen. Havi goyim le mi'iloi. He was leveling off the spleen for him. He was removing the membrane only from the upper section, but not from the lower section. Amalei. So Levi objected. He says, Chus beit fei. You've got to dig down to the lower section and remove the membrane even in the lower section. Osavudish Ashkhe, Levi's father, Rav Huna, came and found him directly, Rav Yehuda bar Oshia, to remove the entire membrane. Amalei, Hachiyam Avua de Imach Mishum de Rav, in the name of Rav, that Oh, Umani, okay, who is that? Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba. Lo asra Torah el sha'al hadad bilvad. Only the spleen's membrane, which is on top of the spleen, that's what's asur, because that's exposed and it's called chelev al ha-ksolim. But there's no need to remove the membrane from the lower part of the spleen. So Levi says, Eidi va'omer of Hamnuna Tanu, we learned in the Brisa, Krum shal atchol asur, v'ein chayoven alav. Now, what does this mean? That there's membrane on the spleen, and it's only drabanon. Hey, Chidavi, what's the case? Ile mashal adad. If you're telling me that it's the membrane is on top of the spleen, then I'll say, Amai ein chayoven alav. Because anything that's on top is called chelev al ha ksolim. Ela de kule. But rather, we must assume that when he says that krum of the tchol is asur, it's the kule. Kule means the entire spleen, meaning even the membrane that is below also has to be remitted. Amalei itanya tanya. Look, I wasn't taught that way, but if you have a brisa, then I concede. Kufa, we go back to something that we learned. Amar of Nuna, Tana, we learned in the Brisa, Krum shal atchol osav chayoven alav, Krum shal gabi kulya osav chayoven alav. V'atanya, but we have another Brisa that says chayoven alav. So we have a double contradiction with regard to number one, the tchol, in regard to the kidneys, number two. So the Gemara resolves it by saying tchol atchol okasha, ha keneged ha hadad v'hashalo keneged hadad. Right, the brisa that says that yechayev for eating chelev is referring to the portion of the membrane that's opposite the hilam. But the brisa that says that you're not chayev kares, that's referring to the membrane that's not opposite the hilam. Kuli akuli nami lo kasha. Same resolution will offer for the contradiction regarding the kidneys. Habi ilah habatata. When the brisa says that yechayev for kares for eating, it's referring to the top membrane, which is alak solim. But the brisa, that first brisa, which says you're not chayev kares, that's talking about the lower membrane, which is not alak solim, and apparently it is covered. The kidney, each kidney is encased in chelev akloyos, it's called in the biblical term. There's a membrane covering the chelev and another membrane between the chelev and the kidney. Wow, it's so complicated. The upper outer membrane, which lies at the top of the chelev, is itself chelev, and he's chayev kares. The lower inner membrane, which is called the renal capsule, is prohibited only midrabanan. Okay, now we're going to have a sugi about testicles. I just want to say by introduction, my wife and I were once in Old Yafo outside of Tel Aviv. There was a Yemenite restaurant there that was publicizing bull's testicles. I guess it's a delicacy. Just the thought of it makes me want to be a vegetarian. Anyway, Bechalishta. Now, usually the testicles are strongly attached to the body, although they hang, but sometimes the testicles got a bang or something like that, and they're just about, attached. They're slightly attached to the scrotum. And here we have a machlokes as to whether or not you're allowed to eat it. Rav Ami Rav Asi chad osar v'chad shor. And Mandi Osar, here we're turning to Tzadi Gimel and Beis, Midolo Biryan. Okay, so now we get into another sugya. Let me just do this.